Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about Hesiod's poem Theogony. So as I'll talk more about in my video on Hesiod that I'm going to make in the near future, Hesiod was one of the most important ancient Greek poets, and he goes back possibly even to before the time of Homer, but he and Homer were sort of the big two, and Theogony is a big part of the reason why Hesiod's so important, because this poem lays out the genealogy of the gods. So it's very much a sort of organized, structured poem focused on how the divine order came to be. So there's a lot of discussion of which gods had sex with which other gods and who their children were. To a certain extent, what the different gods' roles are, but that's not really Hesiod's focus here. His focus is primarily the genealogical aspect. And one of the central structuring components of this poem is dynastic succession. So there's three major generations of chief deities. The first is the generation of the earth and the heavens. Let me find there. Yeah. In this translation, it's just given as earth and heaven, and I don't remember the Greek names off the top of my head. Gaia is earth, but I don't remember the Greek name for heaven right off the top of my head. So these are the first deities, the first sort of rulers of the cosmos, heaven in particular. Heaven basically stashes his children underground, so they can't challenge him for power. And Earth is not a big fan of this. So she goes to the children who are stashed in this cave or wherever they are, and is basically like, hey, I've got this giant sickle. Who wants to castrate your father and take over as chief god of the universe? And most of them are too afraid. But the youngest child, Kronos, who's the deity of time, god of time, is like, yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to do that. So he castrates heaven, basically chucks the genitals over his shoulder, Kronos does. And interestingly enough, out of the blood and the severed genitals, a bunch of other gods are born, including Aphrodite, who developed out of the foam that whips up around where the genitals land in the ocean. So it's a weird thing, it's a weird chronology. So that's the first transition of power. Heaven is castrated by Kronos, and then Kronos becomes Lord of the universe. Kronos has a bunch of kids with Rhea, mostly with Rhea. All the gods have kids with a bunch of different people, including their siblings and parents and children and whatever. They're not real big on keeping it outside the family. But Kronos and Rhea have a bunch of kids. And Kronos, who is sort of aware of how easy it is for a child to cut off his father's genitals and then become king of the gods, decides that he's going to prevent that from happening by swallowing all of his kids. So he does that for several of them, people like Hera and Poseidon and people like this. Hades is in there, I think, as well. But Rhea, at some point, is like, I'm not really a big fan of my husband swallowing all of our children. And so she decides that she is going to get help from Earth and Heaven, who are like, here, just give him this rock, and we'll raise your next child in an island somewhere. Kronos won't even know. Kronos doesn't know. He swallows the rock, and he's like, well, I feel secure in my position. Little does he know that Zeus is out on an island somewhere being raised in secret. And then Zeus basically comes back and overthrows Kronos. Kronos vomits up all the rock and all of Zeus's siblings who he's eaten, and then they become the core group of the Olympians. The more Olympians are added as Zeus and the others have sex with people, various other gods. So like Apollo and Athena and Dionysus and people like this are all sort of added to the pantheon later on. They aren't necessarily part of that original generation. But, so you have the original sort of chthonic gods, the earth gods, the generation of earth and heaven and these people. Then you have the Titans, which is the generation of Kronos. And they're sort of in between gods, not quite as sort of hugely earth-scoped as the original generation, but not quite as sort of refined and specialized and really human in many ways as the generation of the Olympians. And then you have the generation of the Olympians. And in Hesiod's telling of this genealogy, Zeus is very much the star of the show. Zeus is very much the hero. And we actually get this. So a lot of this poem is just sort of lists of sort of who begat who and things like that. But there are some really thrilling poetic parts, and one of them is during the battle between the Titans and the Olympians. And Zeus's role is especially described in really, really enthralling poetry. So Hesiod writes, this is just part of the battle scene. Now Zeus held in his strength no longer. Straightway his lungs were filled with fury, and he began to display his full might. From heaven and from Olympus together he came with continuous lightning flashes, and the bolts flew thick and fast from his stalwart hand amid thunder and lightning, trailing supernatural flames. All around the life-bearing earth rumbled as it burned, and the vast woodlands crackled loudly on every side. The whole land was seething in the streams of Oceanus and the undraining sea. The hot blast enveloped the chthonic Titans. The indescribable flames reached the divine sky, and the sparkling flare of the thunderbolt and the lightning dazzled the strongest eyes. An amazing conflagration prevailed over the chasm. To see it directly with the eyes and to hear the sound with the ears, it seemed just as if earth and broad heaven above were coming together. For even such a mighty din would be arising from her being crashed down upon and him crashing down from above. So great a din there was as the gods clashed in strife, and in addition the winds magnified the quaking and the dust and the thunder and lightning and smoking bolt, great Zeus's wizardries, and carried the noise and shouting of both sides together. The din that rose from the terrible conflict was immense, and it was a powerful action that was displayed. I mean, wow, that's some strong poetry here. It really is. There really are these quite amazing sections of it. So, but I mean, again, it is this weird, bizarre story of like gods fighting each other, castrating each other, murdering each other, and all this stuff. And some of the Greeks, people like Plato, had a big problem with this, because there was one line of reasoning that said this is an impious depiction of the gods, because it attributes to them these sort of human frailties and these sort of barbaric qualities. But one of the things that is the introduction to this version by M.L. West. This is the Oxford World Classics edition, by the way. as M.L. West points out, we now know, and we didn't know this, say, 50 years ago, just how much of a debt Hesiod owes to Middle Eastern, Egyptian, even Indian literature. So one thing he mentions is a Hittite text from the 13th century BCE and a Babylonian poem from the 11th called Enuma Elish. And I don't speak Babylonian, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But these are things from the Middle East that inspired Hesiod, that inspired this approach to writing the genealogy of the gods. Now, Hesiod himself doesn't attribute this poem to Babylonian or Hittite texts. He says in the introduction, or the sort of opening invocation of Theogony, that he was inspired by the muses. So he writes of the muses, and once they taught Hesiod fine singing as he tended his lambs below holy Helicon. That is where this is what the goddesses said to me first, the Olympian muses, daughters of Zeus the aegis-bearer. Shepherds that camp in the wild, disgraces merest bellies. We know to tell many lies that sound like truth, but we know to sing reality when we will. So said mighty Zeus's daughters, the sure of utterance, and they gave me a branch of springing bay to pluck for a staff, a handsome one, and they breathed into me wondrous voice so that I should celebrate things of the future and things that were aforetime. And they told me to sing of the family of blessed ones who are forever, and first and last always to sing of themselves. So this is Hesiod's explanation for how he knows the genealogy of the gods. He's given this information by the muses, who are, of course, divine sources of inspiration. And this becomes a very common trope in Greek poetry, this idea of referring to the muses as your source of inspiration, even though we now think that Hesiod probably made up a lot of the stuff that he says about the gods. But the last thing I want to talk about with Theogony, and this is a pervasive component of Hesiod's poetry, is his misogyny. Hesiod, and we'll see this as well in Works and Days, his other great poem, Hesiod does not have a particularly favorable impression of women. In fact, he describes the creation of women as a punishment for humanity, by which he means men, after Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to human beings. So in describing the creation of the first woman, Hesiod says, both immortal gods and mortal men were seized with wonder when they saw that precipitous trap, more than mankind can manage. For from her is descended the female sex, a great affliction to mortals as they dwell with their husbands, no fit partners for cursed poverty, but only for plenty. As the bees in their sheltered nests feed the drones, those conspirators in badness, and while they busy themselves all day and every day till sundown making the white honeycomb, the drones stay inside in the sheltered cells and pile the toil of others into their own bellies. Even so, as a bane for mortal man, has high thundering Zeus created woman, conspirators in causing difficulty. So basically his critique is women don't do any work, they don't produce anything, they're just lazy and sponging off men and things like this. Actually, in the next section of the poem, he says, and actually there's a double punishment for humanity, because if you decide not to get married, then you don't get to have any children, and so your line ends, which of course for the Greeks was a terrible thing. So, Hesiod has very definitely negative attitudes towards women, which is an incredibly problematic component of him for modern readers, though it's also probably pretty a pretty accurate reflection of how the ancient Greeks themselves viewed gender relations.